All right. Well, welcome everyone to our monthly High Five Live. Thank you for being here. We have a very special guest speaker tonight, a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, a long ago friend of mine, Mr. Eric Sarno. And thank you for joining us, Eric. I want to talk a little bit about our relationship and how we met and how we reconnected. So Eric graduated 2 years after I did. So you were class of 89, I was class of 87. And we met each other on as managers of the basketball team, I believe. And after graduation, I went my way and Eric went his way. And then through the magic of Facebook, his name popped up at some point and we connected again, but really didn't have any contact per se for probably years. And then about 4 years ago, I think it was, my niece Ashley had a stroke at age 21. It was a side effect of her birth control, actually. And at 21 years old, she had a stroke. And I was like, I've never heard of anybody having a stroke at 21. And I commented out on Facebook and about it. And Eric was one of the first people to reach out to me and say, hey, I've got some experience here. I would love to help you and kind of help you through this. And that was really the first time that we reconnected at that level. And then time went on again. And then about 3 or 4 months ago, I saw Eric posted something on his own page on Facebook about an article, I think, that you were quoted in, or it was about, I can't remember if the article was about you or you were quoted in it. Anyway, you posted the article and I read it and I really, for the first time, connected to what your story was. And that's when I reached out to you and asked if you'd be willing to join us here tonight, and you very graciously agreed to do that. So that's how we got here. So everybody, welcome Eric. Thank you for being here, my friend.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. And so Eric doesn't really know much at all about High Five leadership. I mean, I've told him a little bit about our community. He knows that we've got our Momentum community that's got about 1,600 people in it. And what I really just wanted you to do tonight, Eric, was talk a little bit, share your story with us. And Eric has also written a book. You probably saw that on our marketing materials. His book is called Stroke Runner. And you'll understand why here when he shares his story. And we will put in the somewhere online, we will put the link to his book. Chad, if you're going to do that, will you make sure that the link is the one for, is it Book Baby, Eric?
Yeah, that was where I self-published. Yep.
Chad, it's actually on all the posts that I.
Yeah, I'm just going to put it in the chat too.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So with that, Eric, again, welcome to High Five Live, and feel free to share your story with us and kind of tell everybody what happened. And this was how many years ago? 12 years ago now?
About 13, actually, 2007.
Okay.
It'll be 13, actually, July 3rd.
All right.
So, and I was about 35 years old. I'm 48 now, so.
Got it.
Yeah, I was just trucking along in life. I think like we all, just our day-to-day lives of having children and working a job and having hobbies and friends. And so for me, I was fortunate. I had I have two young daughters. They were very young at the time. They were 6 and 8, and we were very active family. I had gotten after high school, once I got into college, I started running and ended up running and swimming in college. And after college, during college, it was kind of a way to keep competitive and keep training and stay fit, was to do triathlons and run road races. And I was always one of the guys that hung out with people that were always faster, taller, stronger. I played football in high school, kind of. And I probably should have run track because our senior year at Rock Island, we won the state championship, if you remember that, in 1989.
That's right.
And that would have been a fun thing to do. But I certainly loved my time playing football, and I played till my junior year. And then ended up graduating and found my way to Augustana and ended up running for Augustana with Coach Olson there that just retired last year. He coached for 50 years there.
Wow.
And learned a lot from him. That was a pretty cool thing. Met my eventual wife at Augustana. We swam together and moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where I continued to compete in triathlons. Prior to leaving the Quad Cities, I started the Quad Cities Triathlon, which last year was our 20th year.
Wow.
And so that was, it's a small sprint triathlon there. But as you know, in the Quad Cities, there's not a lot of water to swim in other than the Mississippi. So West Lake was where we started that race. And that was kind of a fun way. It always sold out for many, many years. And, we have about 700 people, and we've had waiting lists of over 100 people some years. And so that was always nice. So I ended up moving to Wisconsin for work and was continuing to compete. And I was having some back pains that developed over the course of, a few years. And I think with all the training, it just gradually was getting worse and worse. And I ended up having a procedure on my back to try to alleviate some of the pain that I was having from my back. And I had an epidural injection, which we feel is probably the culprit of what eventually formed a clot in my brain that led to a brain hemorrhage that led to my stroke, my hemorrhagic stroke. And so that was how that kind of occurred is, I had this procedure and ended up having a puncture, an epidural puncture, and I was leaking spinal fluid. And it wasn't getting better. Typically those, if anyone's familiar with that procedure, oftentimes a puncture can happen. They usually heal on their own. Oftentimes women who are giving birth will have an epidural to alleviate a lot of the pain and pressure of giving birth. And it's used in a lot of cases, kind of a nerve block in a way. So mine though ended up having a puncture where I was leaking fluid, and a lot of cascading events came from there where I immediately started to feel pressure in my head when I had the procedure, and the doctor knew that there was a puncture. He advised me to go to the emergency room, and what they do there is they'll give you what they call a blood patch, and that usually heals it. And it's basically where they draw blood out of your arm and insert it back into your spine, the same way they give the epidural. And so that evening after the epidural, I went to the hospital because I had been having I started having, headaches and nausea. And so I ended up in the ER, got a blood patch, started to feel a little bit better, went home, felt better for about 20, a night, 24 hours. And then the next day I ended up back in the ER to get another blood patch. Felt a little bit better, went home, was home for about 5 days or so. And after that, things progressively started to get worse. I had a really bad headache and was starting to feel really, really sick to my stomach constantly anytime I sat up, and it wasn't getting better. And kind of the advice when you have something like that is to lay down, stay hydrated, and they usually heal on their own, and mine wasn't healing. So I was going to go back to the ER, and I called my doctor's office first just to kind of give them a heads up and try to get some advice. And the physician assistant was on call and ended up calling back, probably saved my life, in that he said to me, this doesn't sound right. These punctures usually heal on their own. when you go back, I doubt they're going to give you a third epidural because they're very invasive to begin with, and anytime you're in the spine, in the spinal canal, that's risky. So they're probably not going to do a third blood patch. And so I ended up going to the ER again. We discussed another blood patch, but they advised against it. Basically said, this is something that, there's really not a lot we can do for you. We'll have you on, we can put you on fluids and give you some pain meds to help with the headaches. But otherwise we'd advise, maybe going home and laying down and keeping in contact with us and let us know how I feel. Well, under the advice of that physician assistant, he told me to ask them if they would admit me. Just, that was just something he asked me, or recommended that I ask them to do. And so they said, sure, we can do that. And so they admitted me overnight. I was in the hospital for a night. I was on a lot of fluids. I was on a lot of pain meds. I was feeling a little bit better. The next morning, I wanted to shower. I hadn't showered or shaved in a couple of days. So I wanted to kind of do that, prior to going home. And I just thought that would be a way to kind of freshen up. And I remember the nurse taking me around the bathroom, showing me around. And in the shower, she was showing me, the cord. If you have any issues or if there's any challenges here, just pull the cord, will come. And so I started to shower, and all of a sudden my left side went numb. And I thought to myself, I think I'm having a stroke. I don't know why I thought that, because it's not like I had experience in that area, but I think I had learned along the way somewhere some of the symptoms associated with that. And mine was, certainly it was on the left side of my body. I was, just remember being very numb and twitching, and I collapsed in the shower and fell out of the shower onto the floor. And I started to have a seizure. And I remember some brief moments of looking at that cord and, thinking to myself, I got to get to that cord. And there was no possible way that I was going to get to that cord. And fortunately, back, 13 years ago, we had roommates, and I had a roommate. And he came in. I remember his hairy ankles shuffling into the bathroom and yelling for nurses. And then the next thing you know, I remember waking up in a lot of pain, being cold at University Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. So the University of Wisconsin Hospitals and Clinics. They were in consultation upon my collapse with the University of Wisconsin, and it was advised to do an exam, basically a CAT scan, where an MRI, where they could see the clot. The clot was about the size of my pinky. It was in my sagittal sinus thrombosis. So it was a very large clot, a very rare clot to be in that part of your brain. Mortality rates are in the 90 percentile, usually 90%, just from that clot alone, let alone a bleed in that area of the brain. And I ended up with about a tennis ball size of blood that ended up hemorrhaging. And that's usually fatal too, in most cases. So fortunately for me, there was a very, very talented neurovascular team at the University of Wisconsin. Specifically, the physician that was on call that night was one of a few surgeons in the US that is very well versed in the vascular procedure that I needed done. And so immediately I was transported about 1.5 miles, 2 miles down to University of Wisconsin hospitals, where they performed a craniotomy. And I'm cutting through a lot of the story, but and they performed a craniotomy to relieve, where they took off basically the right side of my skull to allow my brain to swell. And they gave me a blood thinner called heparin. Well, so just to kind of paint this picture for you, I was hemorrhaging, and I had this massive clot that they weren't going to go in those days. 13 years ago, the procedure wasn't something where you would go up with a vacuum or any kind of a large, I don't know how to explain it, like a retrieval device, and pull that clot out when someone's bleeding. Nowadays, I think they would. But back then, so the thought was to give me some blood thinner and break up that clot, and hopefully, being young, being fit, maybe some things would be in my favor. Well, I was allergic to the blood thinner. So now my body, the heparin that they gave me was killing my platelets. And platelets, as you may or may not know, is what clots your blood, what allows your blood to clot and stop bleeding. And so now I'm bleeding. My body's ability to stop the bleeding has been severely harmed from the heparin, which they were able to reverse very quickly. And it was a kind of a touch and go situation for a little while. And basically, if you have any familiarity with neurosurgeons, they do not sugarcoat things. And so at this time, there were quite a few of my friends, family, that were there at the hospital in the waiting room. And basically, the neurosurgeon and the medical team told them to pray. And that it was highly unlikely that I would survive this because of the size of the clot, the amount of bleeding, and that was just kind of where things were left. So ended up to where I was in the hospital for I was in the ICU for about 2 weeks. I ended up doing rehab in the hospital for about, my total hospital stay was about 2 months. And then I was eventually able to go home to where I had to go to rehab for 7 months, for 5 hours a day, every day for 7 months, and learn how to do everything all over again. I was paralyzed in the hospital. And, the hospital was one of the things that had lots of different moments there. But one of the main moments for me in the hospital going through this journey was that I learned very early on how to define my own recovery. And I learned that from a support group that I was in very early. And I think they just kind of randomly added me to this group one day where they wheeled me in. And this is after being at the hospital for about a month or 3 weeks or so. And here I am, I'm coming in, I have half a head because my skull was being stored in a Tupperware container somewhere in the hospital. And I was wheeled in to this room with paraplegics. I think they were all men in this particular group, and some had various stories. One was a parachute accident, another was a car accident, another was a farmer that fell in a grain elevator and wasn't found for a long time. And one of the moments that I'll never forget is being wheeled in there and me looking at them thinking, why am I in here with these guys? They can't walk, they don't have their legs, they're in wheelchairs. And then when I think back, they're looking at me like, what is he doing in here? He doesn't have half his head. He's hooked up to all these tubes. I mean, what is he in the wrong group? So it was interesting, but we learned a lot from each other. And the one thing that I'll never forget is the one gentleman who was never going to walk again and was coming to terms with that, said that he was going to define his own recovery. And it was challenging because his friends and family would come to the hospital every day and tell him how he was going to walk again and how he was going to walk out of that hospital. And he was going to do all these things. And for him, he just wanted to go to the bathroom on his own. He had some very simple things that he wanted to do. And what was interesting for me in my personal experience, I had 2 little girls that were 6 and 8 years old. And they would come see me every day after school. And I was paralyzed. My left side was paralyzed. I could not move. And they would crawl up in my bed and I wanted to be able to hug them. And that was what I defined very early on is recovery for me will be to be able to hug my daughters. So all the rehab, everything I did, was focused. That was my goal. That was what I wanted. That was what was important for me today. So I learned a lot of little things along the way that I couldn't have told you. I couldn't have written these things down as any kind of instruction manual prior to this happening. It was kind of like things I just developed and learned, which I became, and I still am very very, very interested in the human resiliency and how it differs. And is it something you're born with? Is it something that you learn? But, you know, my friends would come to the hospital and tell me how I would do, you know, I would run again. I would go do Ironman. You know, I had just finished my third Ironman. And in fact, my neurosurgeon, someone must have talked about some of the different races that I like to do. And, you know, when I woke up, I had my daughter's picture next to me and I had my racing bike in my ICU room. So that was interesting. But my friends would come in and talk to me, you're going to do Ironman again, you're going to run. And I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to hug my daughters. That was my purpose.
Yeah, so I'm gonna jump in here for a second, Eric, and give you a chance to take a breath. That was actually the thing that was the line that I read in the article that you posted on your Facebook page. When I read that article and I read that line, that was the moment that I said, I need to get Eric to talk to our group, because, you know, we spend a lot of time in our programs helping people make a very long journey that's exactly about 14 inches for most people, and it's teaching them how to get out of their head and how to get into their heart. And we talk a lot about setting outcomes and the importance of focusing on the outcome. And so what you just described for us is you had an outcome, and the outcome was not to do the Ironman again. The outcome was much simpler than that, but much more important and more powerful than any athletic event. And that was to put your arms around your daughters again. And that just touched me in such a way that it really, it just really made me want to have you share this story. Because, you know, one of the things that we find when people come to our classes is they think they're there to learn leadership skills, because it's personal growth and leadership development is kind of the space that we play in. And what they come to understand is that it's really that leadership growth is really personal growth. And the things that they take away from the class are much more personal than they are, you know, from a corporate or a business perspective. It certainly applies, and it's much more important what's going on at home. So I really love that about you and about this story. Couple of the other things. So as I was reading the book, there were a lot of the lessons that we teach, and a lot of the key messages that we share with our community and our classes. You actually, in describing and the things you went through, that I read it in the book, you actually do a lot of these things. And we call these, you know, the answers to the test. Things like going first, right? That leaders go first. An example of that, I think, for you was, you know, being the first, I think, stroke advocate, you know, starting that program or wanting to go be an advocate and talk to other people that had strokes. Or one of the funniest stories, I think, from the book was about your helmet trip, going to pick out your helmet at Dick's Sporting Goods, sort of against the better judgment of the hospital staff. But, you know, some of the things that I would like to hear as you continue to tell the story, you know, so our 7 key messages, and I know I shared these with you, but they are: I am at choice. So, you know, what choices were you making for yourself? When did you realize that you had a choice? So you had a choice for, you know, you talk a lot in the book about, and actually one of the quotes in the book, you were talking about when you were starting to learn to drive again, you talked about failure. And you said, throughout my life, I've been pretty good at preventing the fear of failure from stopping me from trying, even when failure could have significant ramifications. I believe you can't let fear of failure hold you back. So, you know, where did you recognize that you had choices that, you know, some of them weren't going to work out? So I am at choice. The second one, you know, raising your vibe. You mentioned a lot of dark days in outpatient therapy that, you know, and I'm sure it was not just outpatient therapy, but during that whole recovery process, I'm sure there were a lot of tough times. So how did you find yourself raising your vibe, raising your energy? Accepting personal responsibility is one of our big messages. So, you know, taking control of your recovery, right? So what places did you recognize that, you know, nobody's going to do this for me, I'm responsible for this? Couple other areas, being vulnerable, right? So having to go out in public, you know, with missing half your head, and wearing a helmet. I think so. If you want to tell the helmet story, I think it's kind of funny that, you know, you wanted to go pick your own helmet so that you have to wear something that would look stupid. I just think that's kind of a funny story, but you know, so those are some of the things that I think you just did as a natural leader. You know, these are things that we help people understand. These are things that leaders do. And I think you just kind of figured it out and took these actions and did some of these things. So as you continue to tell the story, you know, that those might be some of the areas where you could touch on, you know, how did those things play out? Another big thing that you talk about over and over and over in the book is the importance of support, the support of your friends, Nick and Sean and Kurt and Steve, and how important it was to have that support from the people around you. So with that, back at it.
Yeah.
You threw a lot at him.
I did. I just kind of threw a bunch of spaghetti at you there, Eric. So you know what? Whatever's stuck, just knock yourself right out.
No, I think early on I realized I had the choice about my perspective. And, you know, I couldn't control what was done. I mean, I very early on, just like the gentleman that I met that, you know, was not going to walk again, he came to terms very quickly with that. And I did too in the hospital, surprisingly. It wasn't that I was going to settle for that, because I don't know that I ever saw myself never walking again. But in the moments very early on, I accepted my current situation very quickly. I also knew that I had the ability to control my attitude, and my attitude wasn't always good. Initially, it was not good. And I would say initially the first probably couple days, because I think as time went on, that changed. And fortunately for me, you know, I lost the ability to be able to move the left side of my body, but I did not lose the ability to communicate. Mm-hmm. And there are some, if you've ever heard of aphasia, which oftentimes will affect patients that have had stroke, survivors that survived stroke or car accident, any kind of a head injury, sometimes can lead to the ability to lose words, to just not even be able to remember words, to not even be able to coherently put together sentences. I was able to communicate. So I knew for me that I was able to control my perspective, and I've tried to find humor. And that was something I've been blessed with from birth, that I've always had this ability, you know, sometimes not to the chagrin of many people, you know, but I've always tried or been able to find humor, and that's what's helped me get through many challenging moments, and especially during this. And the moment that you're talking about, one of the moments in the book of going to get the helmet, you know, I wish I could say having experienced a stroke made me a better person, made me appreciate life more. And I would say yes, to an extent, of course. All those things are true, but I also I still wanted to be the same person I was, still be the same imperfect person I was. And some of that, you know, the helmet, what ties into that is a little vanity that, God, I'm already ugly enough. Now I have this giant scar that looks like a part down the middle of my head, all these staples, swollen, just a really deformed looking head from all the surgeries. I ended up having a total of about 5 brain surgeries when it was all said and done over the 13 years. And they said at the hospital, orthopedics can make you a helmet, because now that you're becoming, once they were getting me up and I was able to start walking a little bit like assisted. As I was moving and becoming mobile, I had nothing to protect that right side of my head. I mean, it was literally scalp over brain, and there was no bone. So they're like, you need to have something protecting that. We'll make you a helmet. Well, I'm thinking, you'll make me a helmet. I'm going to look like an astronaut or something. That's just how I envision things. And
Right.
what did it really matter? Because I was half naked in this hospital gown all day, every day anyway. So everybody that would come see me, it was just, you know, I had no shame at that time, I guess. But it was like something for me, as I became more mobile, the opportunity for me to end up going home was getting closer. So that trip to Dick's was kind of a way to kind of get out. I had one of my friends that I grew up with, they trained him on how to get me in and out of a car. I had to wear this belt around my chest as a precaution. And here we go on our little field trip to Dick's. And I would pay a lot of money to see that store video, because I was kind of this ornery, just, if you were to look at me, you would wonder what in the world happened to this guy. And I've got my friend who I later had a conversation with that was like, do you know how intimidating it was to know that you almost died? Now all of a sudden they're going to let me take you off campus to go look for a helmet, and I'm responsible for you. And so he's treating me like this little old lady, this very delicate. You know, I was very vulnerable. I mean, I was very vulnerable, and it didn't make me all that happy. But I came to terms with that. But it was something where I wanted to kind of, you know, I was stubborn, you know, and I think that's a good attribute to have in many cases. That will get you a long way in life. It can cause problems at sometimes, but I think ultimately being stubborn is a positive trait. And so we're walking through Dick's, and my friend Kurt wants to hold on to this belt that's around my chest, and I'm slapping his arm down, and he's like, you know, like getting frustrated. And, you know, my friends, I was always all my friends are pretty big guys. So, you know, he was getting frustrated, and he's, you know, saying, you know, I'm trying to help you. And I can only imagine people that saw this going on were probably like, what in the world is going on? And I'm like, leave me alone. Well, one of the things they used to say for me, because I had a visual spatial deficit due to my brain injury from the bleeding. And so what they wanted me to get used to doing to get my field of vision back and my awareness is they wanted me to scan the horizon like a lighthouse. So in therapy, lighthouse was kind of the word to remind me, Eric, you're about to run into a wall, lighthouse. And that would make me go on alert and look around, because I could be sitting on a chair and you could toss a tennis ball to me and I would see it come and it would hit me right smack in the head, because my brain and my eyes didn't coordinate. And so lighthouse would just, you know, as I was getting mobile, I would run into stuff. I didn't know where my left part of my body was in space. There was a time where a nurse was checking my vitals, and she looked down at me and she's like, are you finished? And I was, what do you mean? Well, I had a hold of her arm. Had no idea. I was squeezing her arm. My left side just didn't, it worked, and as it started to get better, but it didn't know where it was. So here we are in Dick's. Kurt, my friend, was very studious as they were teaching him on how to get me in and out, you know, ambulate me into a car and out of a car. And he picked up this term. So we're walking through Dick's, and every other word out of his house is lighthouse. Listen, you jerk, lighthouse, lighthouse, jerk, you know, and it's like, shut up. I know what I'm doing. He's like, okay. So finally he just let me go. I was running into clothes racks. I mean, it was, you know, I can only imagine. I mean, I just hats off to Kurt. But so, you know, for me, I think having the attitude and understanding my situation, letting other people help me, you know, that's very hard to do when you're used to being very independent. And so the humor of that trip, and we laugh. I mean, now my friends to this day will say lighthouse. You know, they think it's funny. And, for some people that might seem like kind of dark humor, but when, it's people that you've gone through every aspect of life with, they have the green light, certainly, for you.
Awesome.
So that certainly was that certainly was an important moment. We ended up getting a helmet, and they kind of customized it to fit my head, and I wore that helmet for quite a while, all through my rehab.
Curious to know what the helmet looked like.
So
Looks like a skateboard helmet.
Okay.
yeah.
Because I had a lot of swelling and different things, they had to kind of make some grooves in the inside and customize it a little bit. But yeah.
So you also talk, Eric, about getting out of your comfort zone. So you said in the book that you were doing some balance exercises and you decided to do them, in the book you say, at the club, because you wanted to get out of your comfort zone. And we talk a lot in our classes about the only place that growth happens is when we get outside the comfort zone. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, when you write a book, I think one of the things that writing the book for me, it started out as a memoir to my kids. And then the story just kept building and building. And as I got better, I got more active. And self-reflection is something that is vital, I think, in for anyone. And I think that's something you should make time for it, daily if you can. But certainly for me, writing and journaling, I had been doing that a little bit here and there since high school, just to document some of the crazy things and fun things we used to do, but all the way to, being in love when you're young, and, losing family members and friends and tragedies. And so when I was going through rehab, I had to learn to write again. So I started journaling through there. And so it started me in part of that. When you're writing, you're also reflecting on things. And I think for me, what I learned about myself is that, I don't think I've ever mastered anything. And I think that's why I find joy in trying, period. Just trying new things, trying hard things. And I learned very early on, or I took the attitude, not necessarily by design, but I just gravitated towards this attitude that if it was hard, it was therapeutic and there was benefit to it. And, I couldn't walk for a long time. I couldn't, one of the hardest things in the world for me to do was to sit up in a chair. And I was used to running marathons and doing bike races. And, I was never the greatest at any of that, but it was something that was just my lifestyle. And I was just used to being very, very active. And now all of a sudden it was like running a race just to sit in that chair, because it's the thought process. It was the physical part that just my body, your brain consumes so much energy just to do the things we take for granted sometimes. So for me, I think I always made the choice that I wanted to do the hard stuff because I didn't have a plan B. I had to get better. I had two little girls that needed their dad. They were 6 and 8. I was sharing custody at the time with my ex-wife. And so there was discussions that I would probably never live alone again, and that I would never be able to be a parent to them as I was in the past. And so for me, I had to get better, and there was no guarantee. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I always, made the choice that, I was going to find hope in every moment, and knowing that there was a tomorrow provided that hope for me. But I also definitely grasp the fact that tomorrow might be worse. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because there's tomorrow, it's going to be better. And so I think my attitude towards that was like, well, we'll see when we get there. So for me, I think, that was very early on to make those choices, to understand to try to develop an attitude. I think the other side for me too, that was very helpful, is that I was very careful on how I spoke to myself. Only I could hear what I'm telling myself, and I needed those things to be positive. I needed those things to be motivating. I needed to have the thoughts that, you know, if you were to say out loud, wouldn't seem possible to anybody. But, you know, I think having grown up never mastering one thing made me, I just find the joy in trying new things, trying the hard things. And I think that helped me get better. That and a lot of support, a lot of good medical, a lot of luck. You know, I grew up in a very Catholic family, but, you know, I wouldn't call myself a very devout Catholic in my adult life, but I certainly have faith in something more than myself. And that, you know, I think in those dark moments, it's nice to be able to have gratitude and to understand that there's something bigger than myself. And you know, so for me, I think I wanted to see, I was very careful in how I talked to myself, and I saw the tough things as therapeutic.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah. So you just touched on another one of our key messages, right? I write my positive stories. We are all the authors of our own lives, and we get to decide what stories we're telling ourselves. And unfortunately, many people, the stories they tell themselves are not the most positive. So that's awesome. Fast forward for me a little bit, so to the point where, so now you're doing the therapy, you're learning, you're living at home. Talk about how long did it take for you to get to the outcome of being able to hug your girls?
Well, fortunately, I was able to do that at one, you know, before leaving the hospital. I mean, eventually I was able to start moving a little better now. Tight hugs, that, you know, that took a while, but being able to move, I was able to start moving and regain function. But the one thing, you know, so in our lives, it's very hard to have patience. And I learned going through this that I'm not a patient person. I probably could have figured that out without having to have a stroke. And I think people would have told me that. But you know, that's hard when you have to go through something like rehabilitation of anything, you know, whether you're trying to stop smoking, whether you're trying to read, write, and walk again. I mean, and so they were very tedious things. And they started out with very touching each tip of each finger was how rehab started. Sitting up in a chair. For how long could you sit up at one time without being physically exhausted? And at times I always wondered where is this getting me? This isn't like, how is this getting me to hug my daughters again when I can barely move my fingers? But those were the small steps you had that led to the next steps. And so for me, I think that's something that I had to follow the plan. I had to believe in the people that were trying to help me. And that was key, because if I would have doubted in any point, my doctors, my nurses, my family, my friends, you know, it would have been hard to follow the steps to get better, because I would have been in doubt. And I think that was another thing very early on, is that I believed in the people that were trying to help me, and I believed in the plan, and I followed the plan, even though it was frustrating at times and I didn't always understand it. But again, I felt like if it was stuff that was hard, and everything I had to do in rehab was very, very hard. So I always felt like that was motivating for me.
Yeah. So then how long was it before you started actually getting, because since then now, fast forward again, you've done triathlons, you've gotten back to what percentage of your pre-stroke life would you say you ultimately got back to, Eric?
So I would say prior to my stroke, when you're doing, you know, like ultra distance endurance events and things like that, it really becomes a lifestyle, because it's hard to like go do one of those, you know, Ironman or a marathon and then go sit on the couch for 6 months. I mean, you have to it's like you're always active. So for me, I definitely had that in my favor going into this. Initially, though, I wasn't. I mean, I think my physical therapist thought, hey, this is going to be a great patient. But I think initially I was angry. I didn't understand why. And I wanted no part of this whole situation. But, you know, I think that came in that was kind of that was a fleeting moment for me. Fortunately, that came and left very quickly. But I would say, you know, I ended up returning to work about a year. It took me about a year. I was off of work for about a year. I ended up doing my first triathlon about 2 years later. And I actually would have tried one first, but I had a surgery in between there, and it was advised that, you know, it probably wasn't one of the smarter things to do at that time. But it was, for me, and you think about it, you know, in the different survivors that I meet now, it doesn't have to be running. For me, it just happened to be running and racing. That was my life. That was like my lifestyle. So I needed to get back to that because that was also my social group. And I would say that's very important for just, you know, being a healthy human being, is having a social circle of some sort. And, you know, whatever that is for you, and getting back to that, to me, and I would say for other survivors that I've met over time, would say that's one of the most important things that you can do in life, is to maintain your social groups in that interaction with people, because that was very healing and therapeutic for me as well. So, you know, getting back to racing that 2 years later, you know, I choose pretty much now, I probably, it's a choice to not race like I did. I still work out and try to stay fit as much as possible, but the intensity is not the same. And it's kind of by choice, because I'm kind of in that mode now where I kind of stop and smell the roses a little bit more than I really did before. So racing for me, I still hang out with a lot of the same people that are racing, and, you know, I'm certainly not able to keep up in many cases, but in many ways, I've been very fortunate that I've been able to still ride my bike at a certain level and go for short runs. And, you know, I've been very fortunate that way. But I think it's because along the way, trying the things that were hard. When I first started running, I could look at my legs and my feet and say run, but they would not run. And it was how I stumbled upon running again. Is we were in rehab, and we were going on a field trip to Camp Randall to see the football stadium. And I was very excited to do that. And I needed to use the restroom, and somehow they left without me. And so I was coming outside looking for the car, and I saw him going down the road, and I was yelling, "Wait for me." And I ended up running after the car with, like, just kind of like the Forrest Gump movie, right? Where all of a sudden you just start running, and I had no idea that I could do that. That was like the first time, and it wasn't for very long, but it was just one of those things. So, you know, there's a lot of moments that, you know, and those make for stories that, you know, I learned a lot of things throughout my rehab from people that probably had no idea of what impression they left upon me. So, you know, I can see and remember many of those moments from people that I'd talked to, things they had said to me, things just by watching people. So it was, you know, I think it was something for me where being able to be around others, and that's what led into my advocacy, right? You know, when I was at the hospital, if you remember that, the waiting room was full of friends. And I just remember thinking, and after reflecting and talking to a lot of my friends and family that were there, it would have been very helpful to have someone who had survived something similar to come out into that lobby and give my friends and family hope, because they were basically told to pray and that it was highly unlikely. And my daughters tell the story. There was a time I went to conferences at school, you know, about a year or two after this, and the teacher pushed this piece of paper over to my side of the table, and it was a story my daughter, who was 6 at the time, recalls, basically, of being at her grandmother's, and the phone rings, and her grandmother answered the phone, hung up the phone. They made everybody get their jackets on. They left the food on the table, the lights on, got in the car. The next thing you know, they're at the hospital, and they're seeing friends and family crying and didn't understand what was going on. And every time the doctor came to talk to their mom or my friends, they had to go for a walk. And so, you know, you think back and you think how it would have been very helpful to have somebody that could have kind of been there to just, not necessarily guaranteed anything, but to just provided a little hope. And that's what the peer mentor program, the peer mentor program at the hospital now is, where there's a group of us, and we just started doing it. I started on my own, asked by one of the nurses, and with the blessings of some of the doctors, and just started visiting families and patients that are in the ICU and sitting in the room and just listening and telling my story, kind of like I am today a little bit. And you take little bits and pieces. I think I went through life prior to my stroke wanting that magic recipe for success or anything. And really it's just bits and pieces that add along the way. And so for me, I think when I meet with families and patients, I don't think that they get any one major thing from me, but it's a little piece here, it's a little bit there. And kind of like me throughout my rehab is I took a little bit from each person that I encountered. And even to this day, still going into the ICU and meeting with friends, families and their friends, it's stuff that's still very therapeutic to this day for me.
Sure. Well, I know there's a whole lot more to the story, and I certainly appreciate everything you've shared with us. We did have a couple of questions. Anything else before? So I know there's some questions that people have that they want to address. Anything else that you think is important that you want to share before we kind of get to some of those questions?
I would, as far as stroke goes, I think the one thing that I always want to make sure is that people understand the warning signs and symptoms of stroke. And it's basically sudden onset of a bad headache. You can see these online on the American Heart Association or stroke.org. But a sudden onset of not being able to use your hand, or having a very bad headache, or garbled speech, or anything that's kind of, your balance is off, your face may be droopy. Those are signs of a potential stroke, and that is time to get to the hospital is of the essence. So, don't go back to sleep. Don't go try to push through something like that. Get to the hospital immediately. And that's really stroke. A lot of people die from stroke every year, but more are disabled by stroke. And I think if they, so many people that I meet, I was fortunate. I wouldn't be here if I was any farther from the hospital than I was. And I got there immediately. And there are a lot of people that, hours have gone by and they're disabled because of that, because they didn't recognize and weren't able to get help quickly. So that's the key thing about understanding the signs.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Chad, will you read again the question? I know we had at least one question. I don't know if people have been asking other questions while Eric's been talking, but I know there was one that somebody asked.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question came in through our form, and it's, my mom had a stroke a few months before our wedding. We could see that it was tough for her to go through that, but she doesn't talk about it much. What impact did your stroke have on your relationships with you and your family, both when it happened and to date? Thank you.
So that is something, unfortunately, that I see more than I've experienced, meaning, it's significantly, I've seen it significantly impact relationships to the point where families have been torn apart, because when the brain is injured, some people come out of that differently with different personalities, angry, very emotional, just almost a different person. And I've met people that their spouse has left them because they're not the person they were. And it's very sad. And it almost seems like, no, that can't be true, but it's true. I would say from my perspective, for me, it was hard. I had to rely on people. And I think that was something that was good for me to do. And I was very fortunate. I had a lot of people around me that were willing to help me, because I'm not here today if I didn't have the support I had. And so I think it helped me appreciate people more, helped me appreciate my own situation. It helped me be more thankful for what I have, how little or how much I have. I'm always thankful. And so those were perspectives for me. I think for my family, I think early on what was tough and I didn't understand is that my friends were experiencing their own mortality, watching me go through my situation. And I couldn't understand why other people were having such a hard time when I was the one that was sick. Yet I could tell friends and family were very, were having a hard time with it too. And it's because at that age, in your 30s, it was kind of the first time they were, kind of looking at their own mortality through me. And so, that was something I think was eye-opening to everyone involved. And, it makes you appreciate things, certainly, and it makes you want to help people as much as possible. It just gives you a different perspective.
Yeah. Thank you. Michelle wants to ask you a question, but before I let her do that, there was part of the book where you talked about your mom and how, your mom came up, I think, from Florida, and it was almost like assumed that she was going to be the one that was going to, I don't remember if it was to have power of attorney or to do some things for you, and you chose one of your friends, or you chose somebody other than your mom. And so, and I think in the book, your co-writer, there's an interview with her, right, and where she talks about how she felt about that kind of feels to me sort of like what the question was. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic, or that part?
Sure. That was so Doug, who's helped me with the book, that was his main contribution, was kind of organizing all my scribble, and then doing a lot of these interviews. And yes, my mother was living in Florida. I'm an only child, and she was not prepared for this as much as anyone wasn't prepared for this. And I felt early on, and I don't even really remember making the conscious decision, but it was probably in all of our interests to have a friend that wasn't as connected as my mother was. I think my mother was still being my mother at the time. She was angry, she was hurt, she was frustrated. Nobody could provide as good of care as she felt I needed. And so I think it was just one of those situations where it was like, nothing personal, Mom, but I think I need some other friends to kind of step in here, and who are a little, not as connected. And, that was kind of the decision. That was very hard. It hurt our relationship for a while. But it came back around, because it's like you're sometimes, that might be one of the selfish moments, because I felt like for me to get better, I needed to make a tough decision. And that was a very tough decision. I can only imagine my mother and her only child deciding that, she was not going to be the main caregiver at that time. But I think looking back, she would say that was probably a good choice. And, I think that, I think if I had to be thrust into that moment, I often wonder how I would be, because that's something, I was never a caregiver. I was always the patient or the survivor. So that's a whole other area that books are written about, is people who provide care for anyone who's gone through any kind of tragic illness or anything. And I think the one thing that I've encouraged doctors and nurses through all the different consulting and stuff I've been able to do at the hospital is that they've got to include caregivers as much as they include the patient. And because there are goals, one of the main things that I want people to think about, especially from my book, in my experience, is that there's usually 3 goals in these kind of moments. And you've got your medical team has a goal, the patient has a goal, and the family has a goal. And oftentimes those goals are never discussed, and they're not aligned in any way. And then you go home and you are under the care of someone who is not aligned with the same goals you have, or doesn't realize that, hey, Eric, they're thinking Eric wants to run a marathon. Eric just wants to hug his daughters again. So that's why understanding the goals. So what we try to do is get the doctors, the caregivers, and the patients all to kind of at least acknowledge what each other's goals are and try to work towards those and not talk past each other. So that's a very important thing. And that was something, my mom had little different goals, and I had different goals, and my medical team. So yeah, it was challenging. But we're good. My mother, that she is someone that is, I'm not here without her. She gave me everything I have in life. And, a lot of my resiliency and the ability to get through this is because of having a lot of her DNA.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. What's your question, Shelley?
No, it's 8:30.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, she doesn't get to ask her question because we're out of time.
Respect everybody's time.
Well, so Eric, thank you again. The book is Stroke Runner. It's available from, what's the website?
Well, you can go to bookbaby.com. It's on Amazon. So it's, I think you can just Google it and Stroke Runner and you should be able to find it.
Yeah, it was a very interesting read. I actually loved the format of you telling the story and then them interviewing somebody that you just told part of the story about, and then we got to see the perspective of the person who you were talking about. That was really a very clever way to do that. I enjoyed reading it. So any last things that you want to promote or talk about before we wrap it up?
No, I just thank you very much for the opportunity. And certainly, if anyone reaches out or has any further questions on anything, I take calls from people all over the country. They get my name somehow, some way, and want to talk about different things associated with something similar to my experience. So I'm happy to help as much as possible.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, my friend. I'm glad we've reconnected. Next time you're in Chicagoland, please feel free to reach out. Would love to see you and have a beverage with you and continue the conversation. But thank you, everybody, for being here. Thanks again, Eric, for your time and for your story. I'm glad you survived it, brother. And keep telling the story. Keep out there promoting and helping people. And spreading joy, choosing joy, spreading joy, and being love. So thank you again, everybody. We will see you next month. Same bat time, same bat channel. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Choose joy.
Choose joy. Good night.